The holiday of Purim marks the attempt by the ancient Persian leader to kill all the Jews. He failed, and to remember the occasion, Jews have read the story of Purim every year since then.
During a time when Jews faced persecution in Greek and Roman times, the Hebrew Book of Esther became incredibly important. It aims to explain the origins of the Jewish festival of Purim, which commemorates the events of the mass killing of the Jews, which was planned by Haman, the king's chief minister. Together, Queen Esther and Mordecai convinced the king to cancel an order for the mass killing of Jews across the empire. Shockingly, something terrifying happened at the end of the day, and you won't grasp the content until you've seen what's next. The Book of Esther. Chapter 1. Xerxes was a mighty king named. He ruled over a huge kingdom with 127 provinces, which were like big regions. His kingdom stretched from India to Kush, which was a faraway place. King Xerxes lived in a grand palace called the Citadel of Susa. One day, in the 3rd year of his rule, King Xerxes decided to throw a big party for all his important friends and leaders. He invited his nobles, officials, and military leaders from Persia and the Media, which were parts of his kingdom. Everyone gathered for a massive feast that lasted 180 days. After those days of feasting were over, King Xerxes hosted another party in his beautiful garden. The garden was like a magical place with white and blue curtains, fancy couches made of gold and silver, and a floor decorated with colorful stones. The king made sure there was plenty of delicious wine for everyone to drink, and he told his servants to let the guests have as much as they wanted. Meanwhile, Queen Vashti, King Xerxes' wife, also threw a party for all the women in the palace. But on the 7th day of the king's big party, he got a bit too excited because of all the wine he had been drinking. He wanted to show off his beautiful wife, Queen Vashti, to all his guests. So he called his servants and asked them to bring Queen Vashti to him, wearing her royal crown, so everyone could see how lovely she was. But Queen Vashti didn't want to be put on display like that, so she refused to come. This made King Xerxes very angry. But Queen Vashti didn't want to come to the party. This made King Xerxes very angry. In those days, when the king needed advice, he would talk to some wise men who were very close to him. These men were called Kashina, Shitha, At, Metha, Tashish, Mirez, Masina, and Maimukun. They were the most important people in the kingdom, and they knew a lot about the laws and rules. The king asked them, "What should I do about Queen Vashti? She didn't listen to me when I asked her to come to the party." One of the wise men, named Maimukun, spoke up. He said, "Queen Vashti didn't just disobey you. She also disobeyed all the important people in the kingdom. If you let her get away with it, all the other women in the kingdom might start disobeying their husbands too. We should make a new rule that says Vashti can never come to see you again, and we should find someone better to be queen instead." The king and all his important people liked this idea. So the king sent messages to every part of the kingdom telling everyone that husbands should be in charge of their wives. And just like that, Queen Vashti lost her position as queen. From then on, all the women in the kingdom listened to their husbands, no matter how big or small their houses were. And everyone in the kingdom was happy again. And that's how a big decision was made in the kingdom of Xerxes. The Book of Esther. Chapter 2. After some time, when the king calmed down, he remembered what Vashti had done and what he decided about her. Then, the king's helpers suggested finding new beautiful young girls for the king. They said, "Let's look for the prettiest girls in every part of the king's land and bring them to the king's palace. Let Hegai, the man who takes care of the women, give them beauty treatments. Then, the girl who makes the king happiest will become the new queen instead of Vashti." The king liked this idea and agreed. In the city of Susa, there lived a man named Mordecai. He was from the tribe of Benjamin and was taken away from Jerusalem when he was young. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, also known as Esther. She was beautiful, and Mordecai had taken care of her like his own daughter after her parents died. When the king's order was announced, many young girls, including Esther, were taken to the palace. Esther pleased Hegai, who was in charge, and he gave her special treatments and food. Esther also got 7 maids from the palace to help her. She quickly won the king's favor and was placed in the best part of the palace with her maids. Esther kept her family and where she came from a secret because Mordecai, who took care of her, told her to. Mordecai would visit the palace every day to see how Esther was doing and what was happening to her. Before a girl could see King Xerxes, she had to do special beauty treatments for 12 months. For 6 months, they used a special oil called myrrh. And for the other 6 months, they used nice perfumes and makeup. Then, when it was her turn to see the king, she could bring anything she wanted from the harem to the palace. She would go to the palace in the evening and return in the morning to another part of the harem, where the king's eunuch, Shayashkas, took care of the concubines. She wouldn't go back to the king unless he was happy with her and called her by name. When it was Esther's turn to go to the king, she didn't ask for anything special. She just did what Haggai, the man who took care of the harem, suggested. And everyone who saw Esther liked her a lot. Esther was taken to King Xerxes in his big palace in the 10th month, which is called Tebet, and in the 7th year, he was king. The king liked Esther more than any of the other girls, and he thought she was the best. So he put a special crown on her head and made her the queen instead of Vashti, who was queen before. To celebrate, the king threw a huge party called Esther's Banquet for all his important friends and helpers. He also made it a holiday in all the lands he ruled, and he gave out lots of presents to everyone. Meanwhile, her adopted father, Mordecai, worked at the king's gate. Esther had been told by him not to tell anyone about where she came from. She listened to Mordecai because he had taken care of her like a father. While Mordecai was working at the gate, 2 of the king's guards got mad at the king and planned to hurt him. But Mordecai found out about their plan and told Esther. Esther then told the king about the plan, giving credit to Mordecai for finding out. The king had the guards investigated, and it turned out they were guilty. So the king had them punished by being put on poles. All of these events were written down in a book for the king to remember what happened. The Book of Esther, Chapter 3. After these things happened, King Xerxes decided to honor a man named Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. He made Haman very important, giving him a special seat that was higher than all the other important people. Everyone who worked at the king's gate had to bow down and show respect to Haman.
Bow before the great Haman!
Because the king ordered them to. But there was a man named Mordecai who didn't want to bow down to Haman or show him respect. The other officials at the gate asked Mordecai why he wouldn't obey the king's command.
Are you mad? You show no respect for the king's right-hand man.
Never will I bow to that man.
But Mordecai didn't change his mind. When Haman found out about Mordecai not obeying, he got very angry. He learned that Mordecai was a Jew.
This does me no good. As long as I see that insolent Jew.
And decided not only to punish Mordecai, but to get rid of all the Jews in the kingdom. He wanted to destroy Mordecai and all his people, the Jews, in King Xerxes' kingdom. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the 1st month called Nisan, Haman wanted to do something very bad. So he decided to cast lots, which means picking a random day and month, to decide when to do his ugly plan. The lots fell on the 12th month, called Adar. Haman went to King Xerxes and told him about a group of people who were different from everyone else. They had their customs and didn't follow the king's laws. Haman convinced the king that it would be better to get rid of these people. He even promised to give the king lots of money if he agreed. King Xerxes gave his ring,
You will be granted all the powers.
which was a sign of his power, to Haman, and told him to do whatever he wanted with those people. So Haman wrote letters to all the important people in the kingdom, telling them to kill all the people from this group on a certain day, the 13th day of the 12th month, Adar.
The 13th of Adar.
They were to be killed, no matter if they were young or old, men or women, or even children. The king's messengers hurried to deliver these letters to all the provinces of the kingdom. They wanted everyone to know about the terrible plan. When the people heard about it, they were shocked and scared. But while all this was happening, the king and Haman were drinking and having a good time, not caring about the trouble they were causing. The people in the city where the decree was issued were confused and troubled by these events. The Book of Esther, chapter 4. When Mordecai heard about what had happened, he was very sad and upset. He ripped his clothes, put on rough clothes made from sackcloth, and sat in ashes, crying loudly. He wanted everyone to know how sad he was, but he could only go as far as the king's gate, because people wearing sackcloth weren't allowed to go inside. In every part of the kingdom where the king's message went, the Jewish people were very sad too. They fasted, cried, and wore sackcloth and ashes to show their sorrow. Esther, who was the queen, heard about Mordecai and was very worried. She sent him some nice clothes to wear instead of the sackcloth, but he refused them. Instead, she asked one of the king's helpers, named Hathach, to find out what was wrong with Mordecai. Hathach went to Mordecai and asked him what had happened. Mordecai told him everything, including how much money a man named Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasury to hurt the Jewish people. He even gave Hathach a copy of the king's order to destroy the Jews, which had been posted in the city of Susa. Mordecai told Hathach to show all this to Esther and ask her to go to the king and beg for mercy for her people. Hathach went back to Esther and told her everything Mordecai had said. Esther was worried because she knew that anyone who went to see the king without being invited could be put to death unless the king held out his golden scepter to spare their life. She hadn't been called to see the king for 30 days, so she was scared to go to him without being asked. When Mordecai heard what Esther had said, he sent a message back to her. He told her not to think that just because she was in the king's palace, she would be safe while all the other Jewish people suffered. Mordecai believed that if Esther didn't speak up to help her people, someone else would save them, but she and her family would not be saved. He also reminded her that maybe she became queen for a reason, to help her people in their time of need. Esther listened to Mordecai and sent a message back. She told him to gather all the Jews in Susa and ask them to fast for 3 days, day and night. She and her attendants would also fast. After 3 days, she planned to go to the king, even though it was against the law. Esther said, "If I must die, I must." So Mordecai did as Esther asked, and everyone fasted as she had instructed. The Book of Esther, chapter 5. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her best clothes and went to the king's palace. The king was sitting on his throne, and when he saw Esther, he was happy. He held out his golden scepter to her, which meant she could come closer. Esther walked up to the king and touched the tip of the scepter. The king asked Esther what she wanted, saying he would give her anything, even half his kingdom. Esther asked the king and Haman to come to a banquet she had prepared. The king agreed, so they went to the banquet. While they were eating and drinking, the king asked Esther again what she wanted. Esther asked them to come to another banquet the next day, and then she would tell the king her request. Haman was very happy after the first banquet. But when he saw Mordecai not bowing to him at the king's gate, he became very angry. He went home and bragged to his friends and his wife about how rich and powerful he was. He also mentioned that Queen Esther had invited only him to the banquet and had invited him again for the next day. But all of this didn't make Haman happy because Mordecai, the Jew, still didn't show him respect. Haman was so angry that he decided he wanted to do something about Mordecai. Haman's wife and friends suggested a cruel plan. They told him to make a tall pole, 75 feet high, and ask the king to put Mordecai on it to be killed. They said he should then go to the banquet and have fun. Haman liked this idea, so he had the pole made. The Book of Esther, chapter 6. That night, the king couldn't fall asleep. He asked for the book that had stories about his time ruling the kingdom to be brought to him. As the stories were read, they found out about a brave man named Mordecai. He had once stopped 2 men, Bigthana and Teresh, from hurting the king. But the king hadn't rewarded Mordecai for his bravery. The king wondered, what did Mordecai get for doing such a brave thing? His helpers said, "Nothing, Your Majesty." Just then, Haman came into the court. He wanted to talk to the king about punishing Mordecai. The king asked, "What should I do for someone I want to honor?" Haman thought, "Who could the king want to honor more than me?" So he said, "The person should wear the king's special clothes and ride the king's horse. They should be led through the city with someone shouting, 'This is what happens to someone the king likes.'" The king agreed and told Haman, "Quickly, go get those clothes and that horse. Do everything you said but for Mordecai, the Jew who sits at my gate. Don't leave out anything you mentioned." Haman felt shocked, but had to do as the king said. He got the clothes and the horse and dressed Mordecai in them. Then he led Mordecai through the city streets, shouting, "This is what happens to someone the king likes." Mordecai must have felt very proud and happy, riding through the streets with everyone cheering for him. And Haman, well, he probably felt pretty silly leading the very man he wanted to punish through the streets with such honor. After the parade, Mordecai went back to his usual spot at the king's gate. But Haman was so embarrassed and sad that he rushed home with his head covered. He told his wife Zeresh and all his friends what had happened. Zeresh and his friends warned him that since Mordecai, a Jew, had already caused him trouble, he wouldn't be able to win against him. They said he would fail. While they were still talking, the king's servants came to take Haman to the second banquet that Esther had prepared. The Book of Esther, Chapter 7. So, the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. While they were enjoying themselves with some wine on the second day, the king asked Esther again, "What do you want? I'll give you anything, even half my kingdom." Esther replied, "If you like me, your majesty, please save my life and my people's lives. We've been sold to be killed and wiped out. If we were just sold as slaves, I wouldn't have bothered you because that's not as bad." The king asked, "Who would dare to do such a thing?" Esther pointed at Haman and said, "It's him, that ugly Haman." Haman got scared when he realized the king was angry. The king stormed out of the room into the palace garden. Haman, knowing he was in big trouble, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. When the king came back from the garden, he saw Haman lying near Esther. He got really mad and asked, "Is he trying to harm the queen while I'm here?" Before anyone could say anything, the servants covered Haman's face. One of the king's helpers, named Harbona, spoke up and said, "Haman built a tall pole outside his house to punish Mordecai, who helped you, your majesty." The king immediately ordered, "Put Haman on that pole instead." So, they put Haman on the very pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's anger calmed down. The Book of Esther, Chapter 8. On that same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther all the property that had belonged to Haman, the enemy of the Jews. Esther had told the king that Mordecai was her cousin, so the king gave Mordecai Haman's position and his ring. Esther was still worried about the evil plan that Haman had made to hurt the Jews. She fell at the king's feet, crying, and asked him to stop it. The king held out his golden scepter to her, which meant she could speak. Esther said, "Please, if you care about me and think I'm doing the right thing, write a new order. Cancel the one that Haman wrote to hurt the Jews. I can't bear to see my people suffer." The king agreed. He told Esther and Mordecai that because Haman had tried to hurt the Jews, he had given Haman's property to Esther, and Haman himself had been punished by being put on the pole he had made for Mordecai. The king then asked them to write a new order to help the Jews. This order would be sent to all the provinces, from India to Ethiopia. It would be written in the language of each province and the script of each person. Mordecai wrote this new order in the king's name, sealed it with the king's ring, and sent it out with messengers riding fast horses. This new order said that the Jews could defend themselves against anyone who tried to hurt them. It also said that on a certain day, the Jews could gather together and fight against anyone who wanted to harm them. This day became a day of celebration and joy for the Jews, and they called it Purim. Mordecai's quick thinking and Esther's courage saved the Jews from harm, and they lived happily and safely in their land. The king made a rule that allowed the Jews in every city to come together and defend themselves. They could fight against anyone who tried to hurt them, including their families. They were also allowed to take the belongings of their enemies. This rule was to be followed on the 13th day of the 12th month, called Adar, in every province. A copy of this rule was sent to every province so that the Jews would be prepared to fight back on that day. When Mordecai left the king's palace, he was dressed in beautiful royal clothes, a blue and white robe, a gold crown, and a purple robe. The city of Susa, where the king lived, had a big celebration for the Jews. Everywhere the king's rule was read, the Jews were happy and celebrated with food and parties. The news of the Jews being able to defend themselves spread to other cities and provinces. Many people from different backgrounds saw that the Jews were strong and decided to become Jews themselves because they were afraid of what might happen to them if they weren't part of the Jewish people. It was a time of great joy and celebration for the Jews, and they were happy to be able to protect themselves and their families. The Book of Esther, Chapter 9. On the 13th day of the 12th month, called Adar, the king's order was to be carried out. This was the day that the enemies of the Jews had planned to attack them. But something unexpected happened. The Jews turned the tables and became stronger than their enemies. In all the cities and provinces where King Xerxes ruled, the Jews gathered together to defend themselves against those who wanted to harm them. The people from other nations were too scared to fight against the Jews. And even the leaders of the provinces supported the Jews because they were afraid of Mordecai, who was very powerful. Mordecai had become famous throughout the kingdom, and his influence grew even more. When the day came, the Jews fought back bravely, using swords to defeat their enemies. In the capital city of Susa, they killed 500 men and also the 10 sons of Haman, who was an enemy of the Jews. But the Jews didn't take any of the things that belonged to their enemies. They only fought to protect themselves and their families. The news of their victory reached the king, and he asked Queen Esther what else the Jews had done in the other parts of his kingdom. Esther, the queen, had a request for the king. She asked him to allow the Jews in Susa to do what they had been allowed to do on that day for one more day. She also asked for Haman's 10 sons to be put on poles. The king agreed to Esther's request. He ordered an announcement to be made in Susa, and Haman's 10 sons were impaled on poles. In Susa, the Jews gathered together and fought against their enemies. They killed 300 men, but did not take anything that belonged to them. In other parts of the kingdom, the Jews also gathered to protect themselves. They fought against their enemies and killed 75,000 of them. They did not take any of the things that belonged to their enemies. On the 13th day of the month of Adar, the Jews fought, and on the 14th day, they rested and celebrated. This became a day of feasting and joy for them. In Susa, the Jews fought on the 13th and 14th, and rested on the 15th, which also became a day of feasting and joy for them. This victory was so important that Mordecai, a leader among the Jews, wrote about it. He sent letters to all the Jews in the kingdom, near and far, telling them to celebrate the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar every year. These days would be a time to remember how the Jews had been saved from their enemies and how their sadness had turned into happiness. It would be a time of joy, feasting, and giving presents to each other. Mordecai, a leader among the Jews, wrote a letter to all the Jews, telling them to celebrate the days when they had been saved from their enemies. He said they should have feasts, be joyful, and give food to each other and gifts to the poor. The Jews agreed to do what Mordecai had written because they remembered how Haman, an enemy of the Jews, had planned to destroy them. Haman had even cast lots to decide when to do it. But when the king found out about Haman's evil plan, he ordered that Haman and his sons should be punished instead. They were to be impaled on poles. These days of celebration were called Purim, which means lots, because of what had happened with Haman's lots. The Jews decided to celebrate Purim every year, just as Mordecai had told them to. They wanted to remember how they had been saved and ensure that future generations would never forget what had happened. So, every year, the Jews celebrate Purim with joy, feasting, and giving to the poor. They do this to remember how they were saved and to teach their children and grandchildren about their history. The Jews all around the world, in every family and every city, continue to celebrate Purim to this day. Queen Esther, whose father was Abihail, and Mordecai, a Jew, wrote a letter with full authority to confirm the second letter about Purim. Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in King Xerxes' kingdom, which had 127 provinces. In these letters, he sent words of kindness and reassurance. The purpose of these letters was to establish the celebration of Purim at the right times, as Mordecai and Queen Esther had decreed. They wanted to make sure that the Jews continued to observe Purim and other customs, such as fasting and mourning, as they had done in the past. Queen Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the official records of the kingdom. This meant that the celebration of Purim was now an official tradition for the Jews, and it would be remembered and observed for generations to come. The Book of Esther, Chapter 10. King Xerxes collected taxes from all over his empire, even from faraway places. He did many powerful things, and the Book of the King's records tell about them. It also mentions how Mordecai, a Jew, was greatly honored by the king. Mordecai became very important in the kingdom, second only to King Xerxes himself. Among the Jews, Mordecai was highly respected because he always tried to help his people and spoke up for their well-being. He was a leader who cared deeply about others. Who do you think deserved the glory of Jewish victory? King Xerxes, Queen Esther, or Mordecai? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.